What's going on, everyone? Before we begin, be sure to leave a like and hit that subscribe button, as it really helps out the channel and keeps you up to date with all the cool stuff we have going on here. Now in this video, I'm going to be guiding you through making your first piece of Nanite Foliage. This will be the first of many videos on Nanite Foliage and will be full of important bits of information, so be sure to stick around. I also feel it's important to say that my last video, which broke down Nanite and its place in the development pipeline, seems to have caused some confusion around my messaging, so let me just say this. Where I see Nanite in the game's development is as follows. If your game is set to release this week, month, maybe sometime early this year, I'm not suggesting you convert your foliage to the Nanite pipeline. Nanite and Nanite Foliage specifically belongs within your development if you're still early on in development, as it is a feature to build your game dev pipeline around, not to just simply swap into. The situation in which you might use full geometry Nanite Foliage in your game project would be if, again, you're early on in development, as well as if you're building a game which, for one reason or another, requires you to use the latest tools and techniques, such as an ambitious title looking to generate content for years, let's say. Nanite Foliage isn't a detractor from LOD Foliage either, as LOD Foliage is still the most faithful and stable way of implementing foliage in your game. It just so happens that Lumen, and specifically Virtual Shadow Maps, don't really like the mass foliage system a whole lot, and as such, Lumen encourages you to use Nanite Foliage instead. I say this because Nanite Foliage still has many quirks which Epic is ironing out, a lot of which they aspire to fix and address in version 5.6. However, that is yet to be seen. Now, with all this being said, as Epic continues to advance and support the Lumen and Nanite pipeline, things like Nanite Foliage will become more and more adopted into games. So learning it early on will only give you a head start in your own development, as well as help to future-proof your project. There's much more to be said, and honestly, I could do an entire video, perhaps even a live stream answering questions about Lumen and Nanite. If that's something you guys would like to see, please let me know in the comments down below. Now, this has been a long intro, but as I said, this video will be packed of great information, so let's get to the main event. Let's get you started on your first piece of Nanite Foliage. Now, for our first piece of Nanite Foliage, we are going to be creating common ground scatter. And by that, I specifically mean grass, as well as just a common ground plant. These are going to be the most commonly, scattered assets, instance assets throughout your environment. And so what is Nanite Foliage? So Nanite Foliage is going to be full geometry foliage. If I go over here, for example, and we look at the triangles, we can see that all these triangles are modeled. And if we go into the material for the grass here, we can see that the material blend mode is set to opaque, not masked, which is very important when it comes to Nanite. Masked foliage is going to really reduce the optimization of your foliage, which is why Nanite foliage has become more and more prevalent. Now, the other issue to consider with Nanite foliage, and perhaps the biggest issue and consideration with Nanite foliage, is with the increase of vertices comes the increased performance hit with world position offset. World position offset can really reduce the performance if you are not careful with your Nanite foliage. And so a common sort of core tenet to live by when creating your foliage is simply to just use as much geometry that is needed and try not to go beyond that. What I've seen recently are, trees that are, 10 million triangles, or grass that's 1 million triangles and things like that. And although, yeah, you can get highly detailed foliage, as of this video, when it comes to world position offset on that foliage, it's going to really start to tank your performance. So finding that balance between what's the right sort of amount of geometry and what's the right sort of world position offset distance to be affected is really going to come down to you and your specific project. Some common numbers that I found that work fairly well would be grass being up to about 10,000 triangles, common plants like this, plants like this, as well as bushes, being up to about 25 to 50,000 triangles, and trees being up to, let's say, around like 2 million triangles. Now, it's hard to really put a solid number on any of these, as it's going to vary based on how many instances you want in your scene, as well as what are the specific sort of constraints within your game project. All of this requires testing on your own project for what fits best for you. However, I know it's always a question, what's the right poly count? How dense should my geometry be? Those are sort of good numbers to at least get started. Like, again, up to 10,000 triangles for grass, up to about 50,000 for, small plants, bushes, and then up to about 2 million for trees. Again, there's variation, but just to give you guys something to get started. So when creating your foliage here, we're actually going to first jump into a 3D program. So for me, I'm going to use Maya. You can use Blender, you can use Cinema 4D. We're also going to take a look at creating this in another way using Zbrush. And when you are doing your foliage, one thing I always say is optimization begins with asset creation. Well, really even before that. Optimization really begins when you're planning out your project, what's the project going to be. But optimization is not something you do after the fact. If you only started thinking about optimization by the time you've already built out your environment, you've already lost half the battle there. You need to really, especially when it comes to something like Nanite Foliage, you need to be very deliberate. So Nanite Foliage has that extra level of consideration to take into account because of the performance hit with world position offset, as well as just how you plan on building these. So what I like to do, so there's a few ways to make this, and specifically the way in which we're going to be creating foliage today is going to be through alpha cutouts. So this is going to be taking a masked texture and creating 3D geometry out of that. So what's the best way to go about this? There are plenty of ways to do this, by the way. For this tutorial, I actually sampled about 6-7 different methods of doing this process, and I settled on 2 for a few different reasons, and we'll get into that. So first and foremost, in whatever 3D program you're going to use, again, Blender, Maya, Max, Cinema 4D, Houdini, even whatever it's going to be, you want to start with a simple plane. It's going to make this fairly large over here. And first thing I'm going to do actually is just reduce my subdivisions here. And then what you want to do is find whatever texture you are going to be using specifically for the alpha cutout, and you want to assign that material to your plane. And then from here, all you need to do is really start cutting it out. So in Blender, you're going to use the knife tool. Maya here, we're going to use the multi-cut tool. And so this right here is a very manual way, but what we're going to do is essentially just start coming in here and making some cuts. Now, for the sake of this video and to not make it 3 hours of me cutting things, I am going to be pretty rough with these cuts right here. And I'm just going to just sort of eyeball it a little bit here and just be kind of loose with it. Again, for the sake of this tutorial, you could be as accurate as you want, as accurate as you need. One thing, just common good geometry practice if you're doing this, is to do your best to keep the geometry fairly evenly spread out. They don't have to be perfect, but like these points as you're making them, just have them be fairly close. It'll save you a lot of headache a bit later. And you're essentially going to reproduce this same process over and over again until you've cut out enough blades of grass that you are just sick of it and you're happy about it. So over here, I cut out a few of them. So these are all the ones that I cut out. And as you can see, this is what the geometry looks like for it. It doesn't have to be perfect. One thing, again, going back to is use as much geometry as you need and try not to go beyond that. And if you're making a game, let's say, where perhaps you can pick up bushels of grass and you can inspect it, then maybe you do want it to be a bit more higher resolution, right? If you're going to be getting real close to it, if you have like inspection modes, then yeah, maybe, you know, we want it to be a little more dense. However, if it's just going to be just generalized foliage that you want to fill the environment, it doesn't have to be too dense. And just because it's nanite, it doesn't have to be too dense either. And so what I did here is, you know, we take these grass cutouts that we make, and then what you can start doing, which I did here, but I'll move these out of the way real quick. So what you can start doing here is taking these pieces and we can start combining them to make even more interesting shapes. So we can start doing this, for example. Once we have our cutouts, what we start to do basically is make our sort of grass foliage kit. And so you cut it out and you come in here and you start, you know, making your grass be as, you know, interesting, as dense, you know, as you want. And you basically continue this process. And so come in here and we'll do another one. So we'll do this. And then from here, what we can do is take this a step further, right? So now we've started to sort of cluster these together, start to group these into some grass shapes that, you know, that we like. And then from here, what we can do is just start grabbing some of these vertices, because right now the grass is pretty flat. And we just want to give a little bit of shape to this. So start moving these around, just grabbing pieces. What I like to do is I'll turn on soft select in case I grab some sort of like rogue vertices. And this way, you know, it'll be a bit more smoother as you grab them. And so just doing this, just giving some shape to it like so. Oops. Not that much shape. And grab this. And for this one, maybe we'll make like this blade a little longer. Like so. So the process of creating the nanite foliage is going to be a bit more time consuming. There is a faster way of doing this as well, which I'll be showing you in a moment. But I also did want to show this way, as this is the way which, yes, it's the most manual, it takes the longest. However, you do have the most control over the geometry this way. Now, granted, there are some bits of geometry that's going to be too complicated, where like the time sink to do it probably won't be worth it. However, for something like grass, where, you know, cutting these out, yeah, it takes some time, but it doesn't take that much time. You know, it might be most worth it to sort of control it like this. So let's just say for the sake of time that this is fine. But again, you know, just have fun with it. You know, just create some sort of shapes just to give a bit more depth to your grass. So these are my sort of final output blades of grass here. Right here. So as we can see here, you know, they're a bit more wavy and they have a bit of shape to them as well, but it's nothing too crazy. And again, if we look at this, like this blade of grass right here, it has 18 faces. You know, this one 28, this one 36, you know, this one 18. If we look at triangles, of course, it's going to be more, which maybe we should be looking at just the triangles. And these are my sort of kit. So this is my sort of grass blade kit that I've made. We got these 4 pieces. Well, and then from here, you could do one of two things. You can either, if you have access to some sort of method such as Speedtree, or I know Blender has some scattering methods, you can use some of those methods to create, you know, the actual grass clusters you're going to be using. You can also do it the old-fashioned way, you know, just coming in here and adding bend modifiers and clumping the grass together. Really, whatever you're most comfortable with. That's one beautiful thing about creating assets, generally speaking, is it's really just about what process you're most comfortable with. That should always be the process you do, barring, of course, learning, you know, new softwares. For me, I'm going to be using Speedtree. If you're new to Speedtree, we're actually going to do this completely, you know, from the beginning, as if you haven't used Speedtree before. So what we're going to do is start with a new project. Games, VFX, we're going to be using blank, so it doesn't matter either way. And one thing I like to do is I go into window properties and I change this style to solid color, and I just reduce that. It just aesthetically, in my opinion, just looks better. And then we're going to right click, add geometry to selected, and we're going to use a trunk. So if you're not familiar with Speedtree, you're almost always going to start with trunk. For grass, you can also start with branch, but to keep it simple, to keep it uniform, we're going to just start with a trunk. As you can see, it gives you this really big trunk, this really big piece of a tree. What we need to do is we need to reduce this to roughly the size of a blade of grass. So again, if you're familiar with Speedtree, or if you're unfamiliar with Speedtree rather, the parameters over here, the tabs over here that you're going to be using the most is going to be gen, spine, and skin. And you will use the other ones from time to time, and if we go into them, we will touch on them. But to create anything, you're going to use gen, spine, and skin. Again, if you're new to Speedtree, the way to think of this is gen is your generation. So this handles the way in which your system is going to propagate. Spine handles the length and the bend, and skin handles the sort of rendering types. So is it polygon? Is it not? It also handles like the radius. And so that's the best way to think of it for now. So from here, what we're going to do is we're going to take this radius right here, this absolute, and we're going to just drop it down to, let's say, I'm on skin. So let's go over to spine. We're going to drop this down to 2. And then the skin over here, we're just going to reduce this absolute. And as you can see, we're also getting this sort of bend right here. And that's because with Speedtree, Speedtree also uses a lot of curves. So we can just click on this curve right here. And if we just bring this down, we see now it's straight. The actual shape of this doesn't matter a whole lot. We just want it small enough to where it's not going to like visually get in the way. This is basically just going to represent your blade of grass for right now as we develop it. The other thing for right now, just as we start to like bend it and stuff, is we can come over here to segments, which segments, kind of self-explanatory, but segment is going to control the wireframe, the mesh density. And so here under length, we're just going to increase this just arbitrarily right now. It doesn't really matter. As you can see also up here in your viewport top left, your triangles increase. And so, okay, so we got that. So we want more blades of grass. This right now represents just one. We're going to increase this. And as we start doing this, don't worry about being so like getting the perfect number at first. All this should just be sort of played with in the beginning, right? There are no just like use this value and get, awesome, the perfect whatever. This is all an artistic endeavor, and there should be some artistic license with it. So, don't be afraid to just play with values until you find something that works. And that's what we're going to do right now. So, we generated about 21 different spines here, but as we can see, they're all sort of in the same place, right? So this boundaries right here, we're going to increase it. And again, just play around. The best way to learn any program is to just play around with the values, start moving things around and seeing what they do. And so for right now, we'll just leave it right the way it is. And next thing we want to do is we're looking at it, and now we have a bit of distance between our blades of grass, but they're way too just uniform, right? They're all just standing up straight, completely exactly the same height, and we want them to bend a little bit as well. So height and bend, right, is going to be spine. So we go back over here to spine, and now to get variation, you'll see that some of these parameters have this plus and minus. Anything that has a plus and minus will allow you to add some sort of variation. And so we click on that and we see variance. And as we start doing this, we can see that, randomly, these are going to start changing in height. You can also, right now it's set to random, you can also do cohesive, which will kind of do it like in clusters, but we'll just keep it random for right now. And next thing we want to do is add a little bit of bend to this. So you go down. One important note, by the way, for Speedtree is they've actually kind of laid out all of these kind of like in order of operation, like what you're most likely to click on next. So if you're ever sort of like stuck on Speedtree, you're creating something and you're like, you know, what button should I press next? Where should I look? Try to just think about what was the last step you just did and literally just look for like the next sort of quadrant within the parameters here. And so, for example, you know, I want to get some bend here. I want to change the orientation. So we go from length to orientation. And all we need to do is just adjust the start angle a little bit. And we can, again, add a little bit of variation. And you can also, in this graph, you can change like sort of the area of influence. So let's say we want the grass on the outermost grass blades to bend down a little bit more. We can just pull them down here like so. And then we want to get a little bit of gravity in here. So again, it goes in order of operation usually. So length, orientation, and then we go to gravity. So we just put a little bit of gravity in here. Again, you just add a little bit of variation to just sweeten the deal a little bit. Okay, now before we do anything else, let's actually get our grass in here. So we're going to right click, add geometry. So on the trunk here, we're going to right click, add geometry to selected, and we're going to come down here to frond. Now, a frond is basically a card that follows a spline. And so that's just the easiest way to think about it. And as you can see here, that's exactly what it's doing. So we see just this flat plane, there's nothing on it yet, and it's just following the spline here. So what we need to do is we need to add our grass material. That all happens over here on the right. And so we're going to come over here. So we have material sets, meshes, materials, displacement. Most of the time, you are just going to be staying in material and meshes. One thing to note is where you click this plus minus button is very important. If you are on meshes, for example, and click here thinking you are adding a new material, it's just going to ask you for the mesh. So just be cautious of that. It's something I mess up all the time. That's why I'm telling you guys. So we're in materials. We need to add a material. So we're going to plus minus, add new, and just call it grass. And then we're going to go over here to settings. For now, we'll turn on two-sided so we can see it. And then all you need to do is just left click on color. And you just need to find the folder that, you know, that your, in this case, your grass texture is going to be. So we're going to grab this grass texture, the albedo. If you're using Megascans, oftentimes when you click on this, it'll give you a prompt saying like, hey, we found the other textures. Do you want to bring those in too? And if you just hit yes, it'll actually just auto-populate the rest, which is pretty great. In this case, I got these from textures.com, so it didn't quite grace me with that. So just bring these in one by one manually. Even though we're not going to use opacity, I do like to bring it in just to turn it off and on just in case. But really for this, all you really need is just the color and the normal map, and really just to visualize it, because the actual material itself is going to be done with the base textures that we've downloaded, as well as the shader is going to be built in Unreal Engine. We're bringing textures into Speedtree to get a visualization. So from here, we come over here to cutouts/meshes. And from here, we can just start with this one that says none, hit edit. And instead of using this, just hit cancel, come over here to this folder and just hit yes. And then you're going to find your whatever folder your grass is in, and then you're going to start bringing them in. Now, one thing that is important to note is the orientation, which I should have said earlier. So make sure that these are center pivot or zeroed out in world space, and make sure the pivot point is where you want the orientation of your foliage to be. So in this case, and in most cases, just going to be at the bottom of the foliage, as we see here. And also make sure that it is in this orientation. So make sure it's laying down like so. and that it's flat on the Z axis. And that'll be sort of the best way. You can also change the orientation if you mess it up. So you can go in here and do this, but just make sure that it matches this sort of maple leaf icon on here, that it's going in the same direction. And we can add the other ones as well. Just again, edit, open this, yes, grab that, and edit, cancel, open again. Then all you need to do is on this frond, we're gonna come over here to material, and we're gonna change it to grass. So now the grass meshes are in here. We have the grass material, but we're still seeing, you know, these white tubes, which we don't really want to see. So come back over here to trunk, go over here to skin, and change the type from polygons to spine only. Click away. And now we just have our grass here. And with the frond, there's also specific controls for the frond itself. You can control like what angle the normals are at. You can also change like the gravity of it, the fold, the curl. It won't be too noticeable with grass. One thing also I would note is, if possible, if your grass is fairly thin, like the grass here, one thing to do is this scale, just increase the width a little bit. It'll help to reduce the amount of instances you need when you are populating it in your scene, and it's just going to take up a bit more screen space, which will just help it render a bit more easily. So again, optimization starts with the idea and it carries on through, including when you are creating your asset. So these are always things to keep in mind. And one thing is, you always want, you know, your ground foliage to look full, but you want to do it using the least amount of instances regardless. And that's true whether using LOD foliage, nanite foliage, it's just always going to be the case. So if you can just increase the width just a little bit, you know, you don't want it looking too weird, but just increase the width. And so now that we have this, now what we can do is just continue playing around with some of the parameters, maybe playing around with the spread. What I usually do is I usually do like 2 to 3 grass clusters. So for example, I'll do one that is like tall grass where maybe there are fewer instances, and maybe I make it a bit taller. And I'll use, you know, something like this, probably reduce these on the outside like this. So I'll do like a tall bit of grass, and then I'll do one that's a bit more sort of mid-tier. So I'll come over here and reduce this a little bit further and increase the number a bit and increase this. You can also change the position. So again, you do it usually in sequential order. So common, come down here to common, and then position. I usually just add a position variance so it's not just like in a circle. And then we can spread that out a little bit. And so my mid-tier grass is usually going to be the grass that I use for shadow casting. And so with this one, I try to find the right balance between what's going to be the right sort of amount of geometry and, you know, how many instances do I plan on having. Now, it's going to be pretty difficult to just, you know, off the top of your head say, you know I'm going to have 200,000 instances of grass. You know, it really depends how big your environment is and all that stuff. But, you know, just playing around, getting some values here and trying to find something. So for my mid-tier grass, you know, something like this looks good, and it's about 6,000 triangles. Again, for grass, remember going up to about 10,000 triangles is a pretty good place. And so just playing around with this, nothing we can do is we can add forces to it, which I will be releasing also later, a more in-depth like Speedtree tutorial, and we will go a bit slower with that one. So I know I'm going a bit fast here, but here, you know, just we could add some forces, like let's say a gnarl. Come over here to force, reduce this a little bit of variation, just to sort of get some twisty bits in there. And coming in here, playing with this a little bit, playing with the gravity, like so. And you can also use gravity to create, different types of shapes and such. Maybe that's a bit too much with this. Turn this down. And so again, the mid tier, I want to reduce the polygons a little bit, as this is going to be my sort of shadow casting foliage here. So, 4,000 to 6,000 tries is probably going to be fine. And then lastly is going to be my sort of wide coverage. So this one is going to have the most amount of instances. Gonna reduce that size a little bit, and we're going to spread it out a bit more, like so. So this one, we're at 11,000 tries. The grass is a bit spread, but this grass doesn't need to be super full, because it's going to be overlaid with the other grass types, the other two that we've made. And so so looking at this, and you might instinctually look at this and say, well, there's grass, it's going to look fairly empty when I put it in my scene. But remember, we also have the other foliage types. So, don't try not to get too carried away with saying, well, I need it to be like super full. So, I'm going to make my grass look like this. Because then now you'll have one instance that's about, in this case, 94,000 triangles, and you'll be running world position offset on it, and there'll be a bunch of instances around you, and your frame rate's going to tank, and you're going to wonder why, when this is the issue. Now, does this look, and then from here, what we can do is, for me personally, I usually just export it as an FBX. You can export it as an ST9 if you plan on using the Speedtree grass system. If you're using like the Pivot Painter plugin, then there's a whole guide on that for exporting as USD. But either one, ST9, usually you're probably just going to use ST9, or you're going to just be exporting as FBX. I do want to retroactively show another process for cutting out your foliage. And for that, we're going to be cutting out this plant here. So let's say we have something like this, right? We have our leaves, we have branches, and doing the cutout method is just going to take a bit too long, right? We don't want to deal with it. There's, too many angles, and we'd rather just get something a bit faster. So this isn't a mandatory program. This is just a process using a different program that will help speed along the process. So what you can do is just go in here and just grab just a simple plane right here, and just bring it in like so. Make Polymesh 3D. And what we're going to do is we're going to come over here to texture map, and we're going to import a new texture. So we're going to grab the leaves, for example. And then what we're going to do is come over here to the alpha and import, bring in that same leaf. And then what we're going to do is come over here to displacement. For the displacement, we're going to use that alpha. And next, what we want to do is just increase the geometry of this. Like 1,000,000, is fine. Now that doesn't mean we're going to keep 1,000,000, but 1,000,000 for this scenario is fine. Then we're just going to increase this intensity to like 1, and then apply the displacement map. And now when we look at it, it looks a bit crazy, right? We're going to fix this. So, whoops. So now we can do is grab all this, Control W to just get rid of it. And then come over here to modify topology, delete hidden. Oh, delete lower, and then delete hidden. And then what I usually do is I just scale this down until it's, until it's completely flat, like so. So now we have perfect cutout of that model. Now here's the issue. The issue is right now, the actual mesh density is going to be way too high, way too high. So the reason for using ZBrush is, one, we get to just create the cutouts in, you know, a split second like that. The other thing is we can just come in here and we can remesh this, we can decimate it. So in here, for example, we could just come in here and we can start decimating this. I usually just use keep UVs. Make sure to check that so it doesn't mess up, you know, the UVs on it. Even if you do, it's not that hard to like re-UV this if you don't do keep UVs, and you know, you bring it into whatever program and you know you have no UVs. It's, you know, this kind of stuff is pretty simple. And what I usually do is just decimate it fairly low. The other thing we want to do before we get too low is actually what going to fix the edges. So if I turn off this texture map, if I turn it off, one thing that you'll notice if I zoom in here is, yeah, it gets those nice crunchy details, but now we just have all these like polygons here, right? These just hard edges. So the way to fix that is we're gonna come over here to deformation, and this polish by feature, just increase it just a little bit, like so. And you see it completely gets rid of that. It still keeps the details. Now, here's another case in point, which again goes back to optimizing while you are creating your asset. So in considering this, what is it going to be used for? So if this is going to be something like a tree and you're going to have, you know, thousands of leaves on here, and you're not going to be super close, it might be worth it to polish this even further to basically simplify the edges so that we can reduce the geometry even further. If we keep the edges too complicated, what's going to happen is it won't let us decimate it to like as low of an amount as we might want. All right, and then once you bring it into your 3D program, then you'll get something that looks like this. And again, putting the amount of detail that's needed in your project is going to really be up to you and your project and the requirements for it. For something like this, where let's say it's just going to be for leaves and you're never really going to be super close to the leaves, something that's a bit more simple in geometry is always worth doing, as opposed to adding a bunch of detail that the player's never really going to see to begin with. So from here, what we can do is let's say you did the Z remesh aspect in ZBrush and you completely lose your UVs. So like here, for example, let me first bring this material in here. Okay, so we assign the material and we're gonna come over here to UVs. If you didn't remesh, if you kept the UVs and you did the ZBrush process, a ZBrush oftentimes, well, every time, will flip your UVs. So if you bring it into here and your UVs aren't quite matching up, but you do have UV maps, just be sure, like if you're in Maya, you just come over here, flip, and you flip it vertically. And then, you know, if you're in Blender or whichever program, just make sure to flip those UVs vertically and they'll line up perfectly. In this case though, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to just come over here and right here, going to just create a camera-based projection here. And then I'm just going to line these up. So these ones are flipped both ways. So we're going to come in over here, flip horizontal and flip vertical. And now they should line up a little better. And then what you're going to be doing after that, once you have your branch isolated, once you have your leaves isolated, is you're going to do the same sort of process that you did with the grass, except with the branches. You're going to lay them all out together on top of each other until you get some, you know, some nice, interesting shapes that, you know, you feel pretty good about. So something like this. And then you can use, you know, a program like Speedtree or, you know, M-Tree in Blender to do the procedural foliage scattering to actually create the foliage type that you are creating. Now there will be plenty of more tutorials moving on in the future, making specific foliage assets. If there's a specific foliage asset type that you'd like to see also, please let me know in the Discord or in the comments down below. But for now, let's actually move on into Unreal Engine. So here we are in Unreal Engine. And we have this just quick, forest scene that I threw together just very rapidly. And if you look at the frame rate right now, with screen recording, we're getting, anywhere from, like 90 to 90, let's just say 90 plus frames a second right now. And we have a little bit of movement on the foliage going on. And if I press play, still getting about 90 to 100 frames per second. Now, a question I get asked all the time is, what's my setup? What's my hardware specs? And so I'm currently on a 4080. I have an i9 processor. I have 64 gigabytes of RAM. So yes, I am going to get better performance than other hardware. However, this still runs pretty good on a 30 series as well as a 20 series. I've tested it on both computer types, on a 20 series and a 30 series. All right, so let's start from scratch, and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm just going to call it Grass One. Come in here, and I'm going to do this up here to make it a bit easier to see. And so we're going to start with the grass. So, and one thing that might happen to you, it happened to me here, is the orientation. So just make sure you're paying more attention than I was right here, and just make sure that when you export, you have it on the proper up axis. But even if not, it's not that big of a deal. You just come over to modeling, just rotate it into place, and just bake the transform here. Right. And so now we have our grass in here. And of course, what we want to do is make sure that it is nanite. And there's two ways we can go about this. And whether you do this or not is really going to come down to what your performance hiccups are. And I'll sort of go through my findings. Now, the two ways are, you can of course just use double-sided, just turn this back to opaque, and make this two-sided. And now you have your geometry. The other method, which I've seen, is to actually duplicate this, and I'll just make a duplicate real quick, is instead of doing that, you can come over here to modeling, and you can come over here to normals. You can invert the normals for a duplicate mesh of the same type, and then you can merge them. So Xform merge, grass, just call it double. And now you don't need the two-sided foliage, and now you have the actual two-sided geometry. One issue that can arise, like when you zoom out, you can get some like artifacting issues. So another step would be to weld the geometry together and then deform it. So just adding a constant and just giving it a value of like. So if your optimization hangup are shaders, then this might be the more viable option. However, as of right now, with the hit on world position offset, for me, I've noticed, I saw this actually hit my performance by about like 2.5 to 5 frames, which isn't really a whole lot, but it does add up. And when in consideration to two-sided foliage, it didn't impact my performance nearly that much. Because what this does is it takes this piece of grass foliage that's, you know, about 10,000 triangles, and it increases it now to about 500,000 triangles. The reason being is because when you do the displacement effect, it also creates a bunch of edge geometry. And so this isn't really ideal, especially with world position offset. Now, if this was static, if this was just a static object, it might be okay. But again, with world position offset and we're moving vertices, you don't want that. You can maybe try it without adding the displacement. And so this way it only doubles your poly count as opposed your triangle count, as opposed to, you know, doing it by a factor of like 10. But for me, I usually just keep it pretty simple. Now we are going to keep the shader aspect fairly short, as there are plenty more videos to come, each diving deeper into each specific sort of subsect of development of these foliage. Still though, we are going to create a good foundational base for our world position offset for our wind, and then we'll continue to build on it in later videos. But to get you started, we will create a pretty good shader, just keep it simple. So I'm gonna open the material, make sure it's set to opaque, and two-sided foliage, subsurface, either one, whichever you prefer. Personally, I feel like two-sided foliage tends to give you the best look kind of out of the box. However, just if it's your preference, you want to play around with how it looks under subsurface shading model, then, you know, go right ahead. You know, all of this is, you know, this is your project, this is an artistic endeavor, and any artistic endeavor, you know, should merit some sort of exploration, artistic exploration. So we're gonna come in here and we'll just grab the grass textures from the grass I've made previously and bring these in. Then from here, for this part, we're gonna keep this fairly simple. If you have a good base, if you have a good model and good textures to use, generally speaking, unless you're doing something specific, you don't really need overly complicated shaders, unless you're doing like an Uber material where it's gonna be like the material that does literally everything, that has a million switches, or if you're creating some sort of like procedural grunge type system or what have you. But for something like this, for the actual textures here, you generally speaking don't really need anything too complicated. So here, for example, we're just going to do a color overlay. So hold V, left click to get a vector 3 parameter, plug this into multiply, just brighten this up, plug this into the base color, plug normals into normal, and then this, we'll just plug this. So V, left click, hit apply. Now, of course, we want to put, you know, something into roughness. For right now, again, we're keeping this super simple. Just plugging this into here. Actually need to 1 minus this. Plug this into here. So let's talk about wind. So what we're going to do in creating our wind is we're going to create a good foundation for a pretty good wind setup here. So we're going to start with an object pivot point, and we're going to plug this into a dot product, and then hold 3 on the keyboard and left click for a constant 3, and then just give it a value of 1 in the green channel, plug this in, and then we're going to divide this, value of 4, and then add a time node to it, like this. Okay, from here, just multiply it by a value of, let's say, 0.5. So we want to reduce the intensity a bit and just half it like so, plug it into a sine, and plug this into an add, and then this into a divide. And what we want to do is whatever the add value is, we need to divide it by double. So 2, 4, and then multiply. So this is our math for right now. Move this over. Okay. And mind you, there are plenty of different methods for doing wind. They all have their own merit. So just because you're seeing this one, if there's a method you like to use, by all means, go ahead and use it. This, I'm just going to add a vector 3, call this wind intensity. And ultimately the wind intensity and wind direction would ultimately be better as a material parameter collection for like a global controller. But again, for right now, we're keeping it simple and we're just gonna use a vector 3. And we need to divide this because it's gonna be pretty intense. So we need to divide it by, let's say, about 50 or 60. Okay, and then another vector 3, so do that. This one is wind direction. You could put it to any direction. I usually just do a 1. And then we need to normalize the direction here. And plug this into a rotate about axis, like so. This goes in here. Pivot point, we just need the object pivot point. And specifically, we just need the mesh particle pivot location. And then the position, we just grab the world position, like so. And then this gets plugged into another multiply. And that multiply gets fed into, we could just copy this, paste it. And this one, we can add a component mask. We just want the up vertex. We just want the B channel. Subtract. And divide. If any of you are wondering, how do you memorize this stuff? It's just doing it a million times until it just burrows itself deep into the mind. But yeah, like all this, yeah, it's almost like muscle memory doing it so much. But anyway, I'm just gonna plug this in into an add. And then we can just copy and paste this, and then we multiply it. And this one will be intensity overlay. So this one, the reason for this basically is this wind intensity will be like a global controller, whereas this one is more so for like the individual leaf. Because sometimes, you know, the way wind affects things will make it look a bit different. Sometimes it looks a bit stronger on certain foliage types than others. And so this, we will plug it into a simple grass wind, like so. And then this, we'll call this weight or wind weight. And we'll give that a default value of, let's say, like 0.2, just something pretty subtle. And we'll do speed, give this a value of like 0.5. And then for additional world position offset, we can add essentially just a really simplified version of this. So control, paste. So the wind direction and normalize, multiply that into this, so multiply this, multiply, math. And then what we need to do is break float 2, and then we need to make float 3. So make float 3, R, G, and there we go. Oops. Like so, almost there. Plug this into here. And then we just need to So this is actually technically done. However, we need to set a distance. Now in the actual foliage settings themselves, you could actually set the distance for world position offset, which you'll end up doing anyway. I also like to do it in here, so I'll just add this into a lerp with a 0. And then for this, I'll just add a distance blend. And then blend range, get a blend range like 1000. And then, whoops. And then start offset. I'll just leave it at, yeah, I'll just put it up to like 100 right now. Hit apply. Oh, and then don't forget to plug this into world position offset. Then hit apply. And there you go. So now you have some wind, and this is what that looks like as well. So I'll just leave this up here for a moment so you guys can look at it in case you're going back and, you know, looking at the material. But yeah, this is what that shader looks like. And again, we'll iterate on this further in future videos. So now everything has world position offset on it globally. And as we can see here, even on my 4080, I'm getting about 48 to 50 frames. If I press play, and getting about 40 to 50 frames. So when we're looking at this, this doesn't look that great, right? Because now we're getting under 60 frames and everything's moving, right? So this is where the sort of drawback of Nanite comes in, and this is where you really have to be careful and pay attention. So here are some of my sort of tips and tricks for this. So, okay, so we have a bunch of grass going on here. Now, what you want to do, instead of doing it like this, which is the most common way of doing it, is you put all your foliage types into something like this, and you just, you know, give them all the same density like this, and then you just start going crazy, right? You just start doing this, and you're like, yeah, it looks awesome. And then you look and you're like, ah, shit, my frame rate. So here's the way to fix that. So what you would instead do, and if you're using, you know, like landscape grass type, you could do that and do the same thing in here, is you want to pick which grass type is going to be your overall fill and which one is going to be your detail. And so what I mean by that is right here I have grass nanite full, and then I have just grass nanite. And again, this goes back to creating the assets and back to the old saying I keep saying, which is optimization happens at the beginning. Or it happens with the idea, it happens with the asset creation. And so I have one grass type which is not going to cast any shadows, and that is grass nanite full. And the reason being is because I want this one to be the most instanced on the ground, but virtual shadow maps, especially with world position offset, is very costly. So what I'm going to do instead is, and I'm going to, with this one, I always keep the max height a little bit lower than my shadow caster. You'll see why in a second. So I'm going to keep this 0.8 and to 1. And then I'm going to come over here to cast dynamic shadows, and I'm going to turn this off. And then I'm going to start painting this. I'm still painting the other one. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to just get rid of these. Okay, that's better. Okay, so I'm going to start painting these. And as we can see, no shadows. And, you know, it doesn't look all that great. It looks fine over here. Not so fine over here. So what we're going to do is this other grass right here, we're going to increase the max size. So this is 0.8 and 1. This one is 1 and 1.3. We're going to reduce the instances. So usually, like, I'll cut the instances by like half. So if this is 300, I'm going to go like starting out as 150. And I'm going to keep cast shadows on. And so start doing this. You'll see we start to get some of these shadows back. Now, it's not for everything, but the foliage is starting to look a little better. Now, and it's also going to run a little better as well. Now we can increase this a little bit more. Maybe let's increase the size of this a bit as well. Because again, if we can increase the size of this, we can reduce the amount of instances we need. And so it'll all just run a little bit faster. And then here I'm going to increase this as well and reduce this a little bit just to fill it in a bit more. There we go. Cool. So now we're getting some bits of foliage that are casting shadows. And instead of having in this, I mean, this isn't that many instances, but for a full forest, it would be. But in this case, instead of having like 2,000 plus 500, so, you know, like 2,500 instances casting shadows, we only have 570 instances casting shadows. Additionally, the other setting, one of the most important setting, if not the most important setting when you're doing nanite foliage, please, please, please look for this setting, is when you're doing foliage, make sure you are looking for world position offset disable distance. This, you want to set the distance. So by 0, if you set it to 0, it's just going to go to infinity. So this, we could just play around with it, try 500. And we'll do the same for this one. Go down here, do 500. And our performance is starting to come back a little bit. So already we went from 40 to about 60 to 70 frames per second just by doing that. This is where I'm saying nanite foliage and world position offset currently don't mix a whole lot. And it's because of the geometry calculations with world position offset. So, and hopefully that's something they fix in the future. That's why I'm saying, like, you know, I wouldn't necessarily just switch all your foliage to nanite now. However, if you are developing your game for the future, then I still believe nanite foliage is a viable option here. The other setting that you want to look for is going to be the shadow cache invalidation behavior. So I'm just going to set this to always so we can just see it. And if we go over here to the virtual shadow maps and you go to the cache page, so this cache page, you want it to always be gray. If it's blue, if it's any other color, especially if it's red, really bad. If it's blue, not as bad, but you still want it to be gray. 5.5, it's going to be gray. In 5.4 and before, I think it's green. But you want it green or gray. And the way you can do that is just set this shadow cache invalidation behavior. Set it to either rigid or static. And then you see it's no longer invalidating. One of the problems that happens is when you're doing your foliage, this is one of those settings that can really be easily missed. But what happens is it's usually just set to auto, and so it's just going to like figure out for itself if it should be invalidating or not. And the issue with that is you just leave it up to the system to decide where really this cache page, what's happening is, like, if it's, let's say if it's worse, if it's red, that means that like every millisecond, every tick, it's calculating like the shadows. And so you're really going to see some frame rate drops. However, if we just keep this, keep this set to static, for example, or rigid, right here, rigid, if you hover over it too, and this is one thing that Epic is actually pretty decent at, is like explain to you what things are when you hover over them. The one downside of this is you can get, it can provide its own sort of shadowing issues here, which I'm not sure if you can see that, but basically if you have something in motion and it's supposed to be casting shadows, it's not going to be casting shadows naturally because it's not going to be calculating it dynamically. And the drawback is it doesn't visually, you don't get the shadow movement, but you do get better performance. Thank you guys for watching this video. There is still tons of nanite and lumen related content to come, as it is a large and ever expanding topic. Now, if there are specific foliage types or tutorials, even unrelated to nanite and lumen, you would like to see in the future, please leave a comment down below or join the Discord, where we have a suggestion box for requested content. Discord link will be in the description down below. Thank you guys again, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.